In May 1787, it looked like the United States was failing. U.S. couldn't deal with its economic problems. It's in debt. All its citizens are in debt. The United States couldn't deal with economic issues internationally. The British are putting these huge duties on incoming American goods. They're having internal economic issues. States are putting duties on one another. The Spanish have shut down the Mississippi. Indian threats in the West. And this is all going to be punctuated by Shays' Rebellion in western Massachusetts, which lasts from the end of 1687 to the beginning of 1787. At this point, you're going to get all these different state governments. And again, you can almost think of these states as independent nations, just came together under the Charles Confederation, really for military and diplomatic means. They're going to look around at one another and basically say, we need to make this national government a little bit more powerful. Just how much more powerful, as we're going to talk about, that's going to be a matter of debate. But where it's at now, it's not enough. We need a stronger government. As a matter of fact, one of the famous quotes from the time is a prominent official saying, we have not a government. It's almost like the government doesn't exist. So you're going to get a lot of people proposing to amend the Articles of Confederation. So all the various state legislatures are going to start communicating with one another, and they're going to decide in May 1787 to send delegates. And this is just going to be prominent individuals from each of the states to meet in Philadelphia. So this is about halfway in the middle of the colonies, to meet in Philadelphia and amend the Articles of Confederation, give them more power, whether this be the power to tax, more political power, make it easier to pass new provisions. Whatever it is, we need to fix what's going on here. So throughout the beginning of 1787, the states communicate with one another, and in May 1787, they're going to send 55 delegates, prominent people, former politicians, businessmen. We're going to talk about a couple of these guys like Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, former military official. They're going to send these guys to Philadelphia to fix this problem. You guys are smart. We trust you. Fix this problem. The only state to not send anybody is going to be Rhode Island, but the other states send at least a couple people. In total, 55 people are going to show up in Philadelphia to amend the Articles of Confederation. Well, when they show up, all these guys are going to look around and they're going to say almost immediately, hey, if we spend our time fixing the Articles of Confederation, we're going to need so many amendments. And by the way, the amendments have to be approved by all 13 states, but we're going to need so many amendments that the amendments are going to essentially be larger than the Articles of Confederation themselves. So why don't we just sit here, trash the Articles of Confederation, and start from scratch, okay? We're going to be amending the thing so much that the original document, it's not going to make sense with all the amendments. So let's start a new government. So these guys are going to make the decision. And again, this is not what they're sent here to do. They're sent to amend the Articles of Confederation, but they're going to say, without their state's consent, we're going to go ahead and start from scratch. So you're going to have these 55 individuals create a government where there hadn't been a government before. There'd been this incredibly weak government before. Now this is going to be incredibly political. It's going to be incredibly boring too. So I like to start out this lecture by talking about who's present and maybe inserting a couple fun facts about the people that are writing the Constitution, because this is going to be known as a Constitutional Convention because it's going to be writing the Constitution that the United States lives under in present time. So who are the people that wrote the current United States government? Well, one of the people is going to be this delegate from Virginia. So when these guys are sitting around, they're basically saying, we're starting a new government. It's a stronger government. They know that this is going to scare the hell not only out of the state legislatures that sent them, because basically they're going to be asking, you got to give up a little bit of your power to the national government, but it's also going to scare the American people. The American people have been told for the past decade or so that the British are oppressive, this strong national government didn't give you any rights. These guys are hopped up on this Enlightenment literature, talking about more localized rule, and here you're talking about creating a stronger government that's going to be away from you, unlike the state legislatures. So they know the people are going to be nervous about whatever this government they come up with. So they're going to need somebody they can trust to write this new constitution. Well, they're going to look around and they're going to say, who can lead this convention that we trust? Well, Benjamin Franklin, he's famous, he's great. You're going to talk about some other guys here, George Mason, all the other individuals we'll talk about in a second. But ultimately, it's not really going to be that much of a debate because one of the delegates happens to be George Washington. Virginia, Washington had been at home essentially after giving up command of the Continental Army. He went home and he was just on his plantation running day-to-day operations, didn't seek power, and went home and just was living a farmer's life. Well, when Virginia calls him up to be this delegate, he accepts it, but again, he's a guy that is reluctant to take power. The American people know that, and they trust him to not do wrong by them. He's one of the most beloved figures in the states at this point. So these delegates are going to look and say if anybody can be trusted not to create a government with a king is a guy that helped fight off a king, and so they're going to pick George Washington to lead this delegation. So Washington will be the head of this constitutional convention writing this new government. The thing about Washington, they're not necessarily picking him for his intelligence. Now, George Washington's smart. I don't want to give the impression that he's not, but he's not like some of the other guys we're going to be talking about. Benjamin Franklin has tons of original ideas. Alexander Hamilton, tons of ideas. Washington isn't necessarily an idea guy. He's more of a delegate. He's one of these guys that's really good about surrounding himself with smart people and then getting each of these people to provide their input. So Washington doesn't come up with a lot of his own ideas, but he's good about getting the best out of others. So when they pick Washington, it's not just because the people trust him, but they know this guy is going to be a good moderator in this constitutional debate. So he's going to allow people with the best ideas to speak. So Washington will be ahead of this constitutional convention. So a tiny bit about Washington before we go on, some fun stuff about him. When I first started teaching, I had a student that would ask, is it true the Founding Fathers, and particularly George Washington, grew weed? Did George Washington grow weed? Well, at the time, I didn't know. I'd heard that rumor as well. I had no idea. I've come to later find out he did grow the same plant that weed comes from today. So he grew hemp. So hemp is basically the same marijuana plant. The thing is, though, that basically over generations and years, people have bred hemp to have higher THC content. So the stuff that Washington was growing, it could produce minor amounts of THC, but that's not why Washington's growing it. He's not growing it to smoke it and get high. Imagine if he smoked a lot of it, and I think there's some sort of thing with the male and female plant. Apologize if I'm not correct on that, but he probably didn't grow it for that purpose. He grew it for rope. So the fibers of hemp are extremely strong, and back in the day they used to make rope out of hemp. So he was growing it for that purpose. And also, Washington made most of his money off tobacco. One of the things about tobacco is it pulls nitrogen out of the soil very quickly. Hemp is really good about putting nitrogen back in the soil. So he was doing it for the purpose of, crop rotation. So I had to tell hemp guy after I found this out, yeah, kind of was. Maybe he did smoke some of the plants, but he didn't get high off of it. So sorry, hemp guy. Another interesting fact about George Washington is that he had false teeth. Now, this is something that a lot of people have heard, and you can actually see this in all of his portraits. So if you look at portraits of George Washington, all but one, he has his mouth sticking out a little bit. Now, if as a tobacco farmer, you might think this might be a dip or anything, but no, it's actually false teeth. Now, one of the rumors about George Washington, he wrote a book years after Washington was dead, making a lot of exaggerated claims about Washington, like he could, throw a rock across the Potomac. There was another one, he could chop down a cherry tree. That might have been Abraham Lincoln, but this guy's made up all these rumors about him. One of the things he made up was that Washington's teeth were made of wood. Now, if I were wearing dentures, I wouldn't want them made of wood. That's, splinters. I guess if you have varnish, but then you got all this gross stuff in your teeth, these chemicals. He didn't have wooden dentures, okay? Let's just get that out of the way. he did have dentures, but they were probably made of hippopotamus ivory. So hippopotamus teeth carved into human teeth, so it's hippopotamus ivory, and or, because he's going to have a couple different sets of dentures, corpse teeth. So a lot of his teeth were pulled out of corpses. Some of them, Washington owned a number of slaves, some pulled from dead slaves. So Washington's teeth were made out of hippopotamus ivory and a lot of teeth pulled from the corpses of slaves. So in that context, maybe the wooden teeth would be a better story. Maybe that's why that guy made that up. So again, Washington, not the smartest guy, but he doesn't have to be the smartest guy, because the other delegates, so there's 55 in total, there's going to be plenty of other smart guys to come up with the ideas behind this government. So again, Washington coming from Virginia. Another interesting guy that's going to be a delegate at this constitutional convention is going to be one of the delegates from Pennsylvania. It's this guy named Benjamin Franklin. Now, Franklin wasn't a war hero. As a matter of fact, when the American Revolution started, he was in his 70s. At the time in the Constitutional Convention, he's going to be in his 80s, I think around 84 years old. So Franklin was, he's not a war hero like Washington. The reason Pennsylvania is going to send him is because he had been involved in politics, but he was just a well-known individual. Part of this is because he was a scientist. We talked about during the Enlightenment, you had these new ideas being published, these new scientific ideas. Franklin would publish his ideas in scientific journals, but that's probably not the thing he's most well known for. Franklin actually earned his name being a printer. So in the English colonies during the 1700s, there weren't a lot of printing presses, and the handful of people that owned printing presses would become newspaper publishers. So you go back in the 1700s, find a handful of newspapers in the colonies. One of these is going to be owned by Benjamin Franklin. Franklin's going to publish a newspaper out of Philadelphia, and his newspaper is going to become famous. As a matter of fact, the most famous newspaper in the colonies in the 1700s, in part because, it was good at publishing news, but also because Franklin was kind of like the TMZ of his day. What he would do is he would publish information about famous people around Philadelphia. So, he'd hear rumors about somebody having an affair, a famous, person about town, a wealthy individual stepping out on their wife, and Franklin would write little passages in his newspaper saying, rumors say that a, Mr. Bilson is stepping out on his wife and is visiting the good lady Smith or something like that. And he would publish this, and just like TMZ, this would sell newspapers. People want to read about famous people, and just like TMZ, Franklin's going to justify including this type of information by saying, this is a quote, it keeps ill-designing men from growing too popular. So I'm not doing it to sell newspapers. I'm just doing it to keep this guy from getting too audacious with his sleeping around. So that's one of the things he published in his newspaper. Another thing Franklin would publish in his newspaper was sex advice. Now, this isn't the explicit stuff you're going to see on the internet today, a lot more subtle things, but he would offer sex advice. And part of the reason he would offer this is because Franklin had a lot of experience with sex. As a matter of fact, during the American Revolution, Franklin served as ambassador for the United States to France, trying to get France involved in the war, and he earned a reputation for sleeping with a lot of prostitutes. As a matter of fact, John Adams is going to show up. At this point, again, Franklin's in his 70s. John Adams is going to show up like, dude, what are you doing? Because apparently prostitutes from throughout France, hey, Mr. Franklin, and he became famous for this. Now, Franklin's one of these founding fathers. There's not a lot you can say bad about him. The one unfortunate thing is this guy's poor wife, had to deal with all his indiscretions. As a matter of fact, he had a child out of wedlock that he would bring around. He raised the kid. He provided, fatherly advice for him. He paid for his schooling, that type of thing. And he would bring this kid around his poor wife. The child's actually the one who was holding the kite during the famous experiment with the electricity. So slept around a lot. This is actually going to lead to the sex advice in his newspaper. And there's also another famous thing with Franklin, him giving sex advice to a young man. By the way, he would also publish other crazy stuff. Like there's a pamphlet he published entirely about farting, and you can find that on Google Books. I think it's just called Fart or something, an essay by Franklin. But another famous thing you'll find is his sex advice to young men, and in this advice, he's going to encourage young men not to seek younger women, but to seek older women. Okay, so what I'm about to read here is not me saying this. This is the founding father Benjamin Franklin saying this. This is one of the authors of your U.S. Constitution, not me saying this. So get mad at the United States, not mad at me. Okay, so this is Ben Franklin's advice for men, young men, to pursue older women. Okay, because here's what he says exactly. Because, and he's talking about older women here, because as they have more knowledge in the world and their minds are better stored with observations, their conversation is more improving and more lastingly agreeable. Now you can understand that, somebody who's been around has probably got more interesting stories, more knowledge on scientific subjects, so that makes sense. Next one, because there's no hazard of children, which are regularly produced, may be attended with much inconvenience. You can see that when you don't have to worry about kids, okay? Because through experience they are more prudent and discreet in conducting an intrigue to prevent suspicion. You can carry on an affair, they're not going to tell their friends about it. So that's Franklin's continued advice. Now, again, this next one I'm going to read it. This is not me saying this. This is Benjamin Franklin, your founding father. He says, because in every animal that walks upright, the deficiencies of the fluids that fill the muscles appears first in the highest part. The face first grows lank and wrinkled, then the neck, then the breasts and arms, the lower parts continuing to the last as plump as ever. Not me, Benjamin Franklin. So if you're getting mad at what I'm saying here, you're getting mad at America. So anyway, he will be one of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention. So the thing with Franklin is he is actually going to be representative of the fact that this Constitutional Convention has got a lot of diversity in some sense of the word, okay? So Franklin, and particularly with religion, at least as far as the time is concerned, there's going to be some diversity of religion. We have this huge debate, and you're going to see arguments on one side and the other about whether the United States is a Christian nation. Well, of the 55 delegates at the Constitutional Convention, probably the majority would identify that, or the majority, we'll go ahead and say that for sure, would identify themselves as Christian, okay? But when they use the word Christian, it's not necessarily in the sense that, you might think of even in modern times, okay? So a lot of people there are practicing Christians and are devout Christians. They attend church every Sunday, go there multiple weeks. You got a lot of people, particularly in New England, there's still that puritanical influence up there. They say prayers every day. They study the Bible. They go to church regularly. You have other Christians, and I'd probably put George Washington in this category, that identify as Christians. They probably believe in the divinity of Christ and some of the supernatural elements of the Bible, but they don't regularly attend church. And you're going to have a lot of guys that would fit in Franklin's category. So Franklin would be somebody who thinks the lessons taught in the Bible are valuable, but they're not, the supernatural elements probably aren't real. And probably all the events, or at least a good chunk of the events that happened in the Bible, didn't actually occur. The stuff like the parting of the Red Sea, the burning bush, that's made up, or it's just sort of an exaggeration, misunderstanding of what actually happened. So Franklin, you could probably maybe even not call him a Christian. You probably more identify him as a deist. We're going to see a couple guys here that would again, maybe believe the Bible's good, but they're not going to believe in, word for word what it says. So Franklin and a number of these other delegates would feel that there is a God, but the God doesn't interfere with the day-to-day life of people. He's not there to punish. He's not there to reward. He basically started the earth, and then he sort of just put it on autopilot, and then he's sitting there watching from above. So you'd get a lot of these guys that believe, again, the lessons of the Bible, but don't believe in the divinity of Christ or God's judgment, anything like that. There are actually going to be a couple people at the convention. And by the way, I should point out before going on, of the Christians, there is going to be some diversity in Christianity. We're going to have a number of different Protestant denominations, and you are going to have a handful of Catholics at this as well. The delegates from Maryland, for example, are Catholics. There isn't going to be any Muslims, Jews, or any other religion. But again, at the time, you probably wouldn't find but just a handful of those religions in the United States anyway. So for the colonies, there's some diversity of religion. Now, there are going to be people at this convention that you would probably refer to as atheist, okay? One of the delegates is a guy from New York, Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton is not, he's going to become a Christian later in life. He's going to identify as a Christian. He'll regularly attend church, beginning in the 1790s. But at the time of the Constitutional Convention, 1787, he didn't attend church, and you would, again, probably classify him as an atheist. Basically, he didn't believe in the supernatural elements of the Bible, didn't believe in, thought the Bible was useful for some purposes, but didn't think it was, some guidebook for humanity. As a matter of fact, people are going to say, why don't we say prayers before the Constitutional Convention? And he's just going to say, well, we don't need, divine intervention, I believe is what he said, or foreign aid is what he said. We don't need foreign aid here. And people are going to later question, why don't you put God in the Constitution? We forgot, So he will later be a Christian, but at the time I think you'd classify him as an atheist. So you have this diversity of religion here. So saying it's in Christian documents not true. A lot of Christians wrote it, but non-Christians wrote it as well. And even though there are a lot of Christians, all these guys are going to specifically understand there needs to be a separation of church and state. Now, you've got a lot of reasons for this. You have, by this point, a lot of the states, Virginia, Rhode Island, for a very long time, have separation of church and state, not just because they thought that the church could influence the state, but they thought that the state and politics could influence the church. And also they have like a real-world example of what can happen if you have church influencing the state. In Spain had been downhill for a long time, and a lot of people blamed the church influence on Spanish politics. So these guys say this isn't a good way to run a country, so we're going to explicitly leave our religion out of the Constitution. So Hamilton represents this diversity of religion. He's also going to represent diversity of thought. So a lot of people that are attending this convention, or as a matter of fact, all of them, recognize the Arts Confederation is too weak. We need to make the national government stronger. We need to give more power to this government. But some people thought, we only need a little bit of power. Alexander Hamilton is going to be one of those guys at the opposite end. He's going to be arguing at this Constitutional Convention that essentially you should establish just a monarchy. He's going to be talking about creating an executive branch, a president who serves for life. He thinks that the national government should have all the power and states should have little to no power. Other people say, we think states maybe have a tiny bit too much power here in the Arts Confederation. National government needs a tiny bit more. Hamilton's going to be the opposite. So there's a lot of diversity of thought in this thing. Hamilton's the delegate for New York. One of the other famous delegates, and actually the guy who's going to be writing all the Constitution ideas down, is going to be this guy, James Madison. Madison is probably at the lower end. He thinks the national government needs to be stronger, but he thinks still most of the power, and the vast majority of the power, should still be reserved in the states. So Madison, as the guy, you can call him the father of the Constitution, because not because he comes up with all the ideas, but you can basically think about it this way. All these guys are sitting around this convention. They'll have a debate. What do you think about this to run the government? I think that's a dumb idea. I think it's a good idea. Finally, when they get settled, they'll say, Madison, write this down. And so Madison will write down their ideas in the Constitution. So whenever you read the Constitution, if there's maybe a dispute over a comma or some of the wording's confusing, a lot of it you can point back to James Madison, because he's the actual author of the Constitution. So doesn't come up with the ideas, he writes them down. Now, I wish I had fun stories to say about James Madison, but he's pretty boring. As a matter of fact, people just basically said he said nothing at social events. He has an incredibly interesting and beautiful wife named Dolly Madison. She's going to be sort of the person that socializes for the couple, and a lot of times she speaks for James Madison. But he himself isn't interesting. I guess one of the things you could say is interesting about him is incredibly small guy. He's 5'2", weighed less than 100 pounds. He'll later be president. We'll talk about him when he's president. But if there were ever a president cage fighting tournament, he'd probably end up in the bottom 5. Not a very big person. So smart. Obviously the author of the Constitution, but not a lot of fun stories about him. So we have these guys, and again, we mentioned diversity, at least somewhat diversity of religion, diversity of thought for sure, but there's not going to be diversity in other ways, okay? So all these guys are going to be well educated, or let me say this, the vast majority are going to be well educated. That's an incredible minority in the colonies at the time. Most people didn't receive an education. Very few actually received public schooling. Now, the majority of people within the states could read, but most didn't have education, higher education. Most of these guys do. Most of these guys are successful. Most of these guys are wealthy. Now, there's a handful you could qualify as middle class. There's a couple, if you squint, maybe you could say they're lower than middle class, but the vast majority of these 55 delegates are going to be wealthy. They're going to have tons of property. So you should keep that in mind. Very wealthy. We're not having everybody from different spectrums come here. You don't see, it's not made up of mostly poor people, which would be most of the people in the states, mostly poor. Instead, this is going to be mostly wealthy people writing this thing. So they're successful, they're wealthy, they're also male. There's not going to be any women here. Now, a lot of these men are writing their wives, they're having input through their husbands, but that's not direct influence. So they're all male. They're also all white. There's not going to be anybody that of color. There's not going to be any blacks here, even though slaves make up a significant portion of the population, especially in southern states. So as one of the criticisms you see of the Constitution is there's not a lot of diversity in terms of race and sex. And you'll actually, about a third of these guys are slave owners. So a third of the guys actually own human property. So there's, again, a lot of diversity of thought, but not a lot of diversity in other ways, which is going to be a criticism of this Constitution coming down the road. All right, so keeping all this in mind, these guys have a big task upon them. Write this new government in a way that the states are going to accept, the people are going to accept, and it's also going to be functional. Well, what these guys are going to determine when writing the new Constitution is we need a federal government. We need a government where both the national government, this United States government, has power, and states also have power. Again, states aren't going to approve of this if it takes all their power and puts it in the national government. So we need something that makes this thing more powerful enough to handle these problems, but not too powerful where the states don't approve it. So what they're going to come up with in this new Constitution is they're going to basically come up with this idea that we should have, quote, a sovereign union of sovereign states. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean to be sovereign union of sovereign states? You can basically think a, independent union of independent states. That's kind of confusing. But most of the people here, when they're thinking that, they're thinking that national government's going to have some power, states are going to have some power. Now, what exactly this means, they're going to leave some of this up for debate, actually, and we're going to see this argued all the way up until the Civil War and even present times. But what they're going to basically decide is states should retain just about all the power they had before. So states are going to be handling local political matters. They're still going to be able to pass laws. They're going to be holding election for state offices. They're going to still be able to tax. They're going to do all those things, okay? So they're still going to hold these powers and at the local level handle these issues. It's just they're going to add a couple more powers to the national government. So it's more going to be that we're adding powers to the national government, less that we're taking away powers from the state government. So states can still do their things. They can still have state laws. They can still set up state courts to try these laws. They can still tax state taxes, that type of thing. Just now the national government, as we're going to see, is going to be able to do those things as well. And we're going to have this sort of shared power arrangement. All right, so what we're going to, one thing when these guys sit down and debate, who should hold what power, who should hold the other power, one of the things they're going to be pretty clear on is the national government should still be the one to deal with international matters, okay? So the national government under the Articles of Confederation was the exclusive body that could declare war. So national government is the only one that can declare war. We don't want Georgia declaring war on Spain, bringing us into it. So the national government declare war. It's going to be the one to maintain a national army. So if we get into a war, you can still have state militias, but we need a national army to fight our wars. That's in the charge of this national government. National government's also going to retain the power to make treaties. Again, we're going to group up together to better deal with foreign countries. So if we have an issue with France, we're not going to handle it. Massachusetts isn't going to have its own treaty with France. New Hampshire isn't going to have its own treaty. We're all standing together, and we're all going to abide by this treaty. So a national government will retain those powers. It's also going to retain the power to regulate international trade. So under the Articles of Confederation, you could pass duties on incoming and outgoing goods, but it was difficult to do so. And we're going to talk about exactly how they do it in a second here, but they're going to retain this power to regulate international trade. It's just they're going to make it a lot easier to do so, okay? All right, so these things stay with the national government, but they're going to add new powers. They're going to give to the national government the exclusive power to regulate interstate trade. So under the Articles of Confederation, we had Georgia passing duties on South Carolina then passing duties back on Georgia, and it creates this gridlock where, free trade is going to be difficult between the states, which hurts the economy of everybody. Well, in the Constitution, specifically to address that problem, it says the national government has the power to regulate trade. And in this line, basically, it's just a single line that says regulate interstate trade, regulate trade with Indians, and we'll talk about Indian issues later, but regulate trade with between states. Just a tiny line that doesn't sound very important, and it's really not going to be that important, except for they're going to prevent states from passing duties on one another. But it's not going to be important in the 1700s or 1800s, but later on, 1900s, it'll become incredibly important, because if you can regulate interstate trade and you start getting these big corporations trading across interstate lines, couldn't you then tell those corporations, hey, you have to get rid of race restrictions on who can work, that type of thing. We're going to see that in the 20th century. You can't hire child workers anymore. They're not thinking anything about that at the time, but they just put that little provision in. We can regulate interstate trade. The states cannot do that. All right, so that's going to be something. Now it's going to say the national government can still pass laws. It can pass laws under the Articles of Confederation as long as it gave it that power. Well, it's going to say if the Constitution says the national government can do something, it can pass laws to allow it to do something better. So now that the national government, one of the things it's going to now be able to do is tax. So it's going to add this in the Constitution. So under the Articles of Confederation, the national government cannot tax. Now it can. And let's say that you need to pay for a debt or something, you need a tax. Well, the Constitution says the government can tax. Now they can pass laws to make taxing easier. So somebody who doesn't pay their tax can go to jail or something like that. That's something that you can do under this new Constitution. Not only tax, but tax to allow the national government to fill out its obligations. As we're going to see, as part of its obligation to keep the U.S. secure, which is under that military provision, you can maybe pass laws that threaten national security, that type of thing. That's afforded under this new Constitution. So, national government can do that. Another provision of the Constitution, and I'm giving a simplified version here, but it says the national government exclusively can print money. States can no longer do that. Now, there's some get-arounds to this, but basically we don't want what happened in Rhode Island happening anymore, where the state governments just start printing out money left and right and destroying the economy. Only the national government can mint money, all right? So that's going to be a thing. So let me just repeat that. Now, this is going to retain the powers under the Articles of Confederation of making war. That's the national government, making treaties. They add the power to tax, okay? And so this national government, in order to provide for the national security tax, you can pass laws that are going to help you fulfill those obligations. The national government retains the power to regulate international trade, so you can put duties on goods coming into out of the United States. Now the national government can regulate interstate trade. That wasn't allowed under the Articles of Confederation. And again, it gets the exclusive power to print and mint money. All right, so these guys decide we've got to make this thing stronger. We're adding these powers. How do we carry these things out? Well, this is another way this new Constitution is going to be different than the Articles of Confederation. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was just a legislature, a body that passed laws. And when they passed the laws, they left it up to the states to execute the laws and to try the laws. Sometimes states didn't do that. I don't agree with this law. I'm not going to carry it out. I'm not going to put any effort into carrying it out. I'm not going to try it. Well, the way they're going to set this new Constitution up is they're going to make it to where we still have this legislative branch, and we're going to talk about how that's apportioned pretty soon here, a body that passes laws, but we need a body to make sure the laws are carried out. So in order to do that, we need somebody to execute the laws. So we're going to create an executive branch. And we also need somebody to try laws created by this new national government. Again, before this was done under the states, so they would expect states to try national laws. That didn't work, so we need to create our own court system. So we're going to create a judicial branch to try national laws, okay? So they're going to decide to create this three-tiered system, law writing branch, which they had before in the Articles, but now they're adding an executive branch and a judicial branch. One thing I want to point out, when they're writing this, the legislative branch, if you look under the Constitution, it's got way more powers than these other two. Now, as we're going to talk about, there's going to be put in place checks and balances between these powers, but in your political science class, you'll learn, they're supposed to be sort of equal here. But the way they write it, they're going to give way more power to the legislative branch. So legislative branch will be the law writing branch, the one that executes the laws, executive branch, and the one that tries the laws is judicial branch. And we're going to talk about each one of these separately, but basically we got to figure out how they're going to, how each of these branches are going to be formed, and what powers are going to be given to each. So as the most powerful body, the legislative branch receives way more space in the Constitution than the other two branches, okay? So legislative branch. Under the Articles of Confederation, they had this, one state got one vote, and then if you got 9 of 13 states to agree to something, a law could be passed. Again, as long as it adhered to what the national government should do. Same thing here. Legislative branch can write laws. So legislative branch, if you need to fulfill security to the United States, if there's something that needs to be done to protect the United States, and the national government can pass this law. So I'm making up an example here. Let's say after the American Revolution, you have British merchants that are causing trouble, or it looks like they're spying on Britain. Maybe you could pass a law saying that any British-born citizen that's caught spying is punished by 20 years in a federal prison or something like that. Although the word prison isn't exactly what they would use back then, but you get punished by 20 years imprisonment. So they could pass a law like that. They could pass a law doing, for tax purposes or something like that. So one of the powers that this new legislative branch will get is to write new laws, but it's also going to get the power to tax. So let's say a conflict arises with Spain. Let's say Spanish are shutting down your rivers. You want to show them force. You need to raise an army. You don't have the money to pay the soldiers. Well, what the new legislative branch can do is write an internal tax. So they can also, again, and we talked about this before, increase duties on income and outgoing goods, but they now have the power that the states exclusively had before. They now have the power to tax. So we want to build up an army. Let's make it to where every jar of honey, making this up, but every jar of honey sold in the colonies, every time you buy a jar of honey, you got to pay a penny to the national government. We use this to pay an army to threaten Spain to open up its rivers. Again, just making this up, but using that as an example. But they now have the power to tax, and the legislative branch is the one that passes new taxes. It passes new laws, passes new taxes, okay? And basically, this is exemplified in this necessary and proper clause in the Constitution. They say in there, the Congress shall have the power to make laws which should be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Okay, so every other power laid in the Constitution, we can pass laws to execute these the powers given to this national government. So if we need to tax, we can tax. If we need to pass laws to make sure we can protect the United States, we can do that. All right. If the legislative branch wanted to write a new law that isn't afforded by the Constitution, they would have to amend the Constitution, which is going to require 2/3 of the legislature and 2/3 of the states, or 3/5 of these state conventions. 3/4 of the state legislatures, or 2/3 of state conventions to approve of it. So, a legislative branch can do a lot. New laws. And they can write new laws, new taxes, and they can. But again, they're limited by, does the rest of the Constitution allow them to pass these laws? All right, so we've got this new legislative branch, very powerful. Can now taxing, which a lot of people are nervous about. That's part of the reason you revolted from Britain, is you felt they were taxing too much. So how is this thing going to be apportioned up? Under the Articles of Confederation, the legislative branch was one state, one vote. So they would all send these guys initially to Philadelphia, then New York. Well, what are we going to do here? Well, what they're going to decide is, well, they don't initially decide. So there's going to be this huge debate at this convention. How do we divide up representation? Who gets to vote for new laws and new taxes? Who should make up this legislature? Well, Georgia and New Jersey are going to, the delegates from Georgia and New Jersey are going to fall behind something that we come to call the New Jersey Plan. They're basically going to say, well, heck, guys, we had it right under the Articles of Confederation. Let's do the same thing, one state, one vote. Because basically, we had it right before. We should keep it up this way. Well, Virginia and New York are going to shoot back, and they're going to argue with this Virginia plan, basically saying, that doesn't make sense. Georgia, you have 1/10 of the population Virginia do. New Jersey, 1/10 the population. New York's along with Virginia, because New York and Virginia both have a lot of people. So Georgia around this time, something like 75,000 people. Virginia, 750,000 people. New York a little bit lower, but not by much. So Virginia and New York, they say, why would this state with only 75,000 people get the same number of votes as I get? And you're going to see them arguing this Virginia plan that representation should be apportioned by population. So we should count up the number of people, and when we come to write laws and pass new taxes in this national government, Virginia should have 10 times what Georgia has. Because it has 10 times the amount of people. So we should have representation that way. New York's going to say, Virginia's got it. I agree with it. Again, because if we voted this way, New York would get 9. Well, Georgia and New Jersey are going to shoot back and say, Well, what this means is that you, New York and Virginia, if you decide to do something, you can do it just with your two states. Basically, you can outvote the rest of us if we do it based on population, because your two states basically outnumber all the rest of the states. So you can impose laws on us however you want. By the way, one thing they are going to quickly figure out is that getting 9 out of 13 states, or 2/3, that's illogical. We want to do it by a simple majority, and that's going to be one of the things debated. But how do we do this majority vote? Okay, so we want it to be a simple majority. We don't want to wait until 2/3 get on the Articles of Confederation, because nothing gets done. But we don't want it. New York and Virginia don't want it by state, because again, they got a lot more people than states like Georgia. By the way, Virginia and New York, they look at it and they say a handful of the small states could get together and outvote them. So the small states are worried that Virginia and New York, the bigger states, are going to outvote them. The bigger states don't want the smaller states to outvote them. So this is actually going to be such a huge debate at this Constitutional Convention that delegates almost walk out. And along with this, there's another debate. Some of the people at this are incredibly hopped up in the Enlightenment, and they're going to say, how do we choose representatives to whatever legislative body we come up with? Some people, again, those hopped up in the Enlightenment, will say, well, let the people decide, and we should just let all adult males vote. Now, because of the English sort of belief about women's place not being in politics, there's not anybody arguing about women voters, but some basically, this convention basically say, the people chosen to this legislative branch should be chosen by, just average Joe Schmo. They should pick it. Other people at this convention are going to point to examples like Rhode Island and Maryland during the Articles of Confederation period and say, hey, if you let average Joe Schmo in there, they're going to put in place these ideologues, or these guys that aren't qualified to serve in office. They're just people that are flashy or showy. They're going to be promising people things they can't deliver, and people without education or people without property, don't have a vested interest in it, in the economy, are just going to put in people that are going to fulfill their immediate interests, or somebody that's exciting. They're not going to put in somebody in place that's responsible. So another debate here is the level of democracy you have. Some people think whatever this legislature is should be directly chosen by the people. Others say we need a layer between the people, or we need to limit who can serve in this. By the way, this is kind of what's going on with Parliament over there, who can participate in Parliament. As we're going to see, this is going to be very similar setup to what we have with this constitutional government in a sense. But who should be able to participate in selecting the representatives, and how do we apportion the representatives? Well, this debate is going to go back and forth. This is probably the biggest debate. And again, some people arguing for the Virginia plan, others arguing for the New Jersey plan. Ultimately, you're going to get this guy from Connecticut, a guy named Roger Sherman. He's going to come up with this great compromise, or sometimes you'll hear it called the Connecticut Compromise. And what Roger Sherman is going to propose is, guys, let's not do it Virginia's way. Let's not do it Georgia's way. Instead, what we should do is we should have two separate houses. We should have a bicameral legislature. So to make the smaller states happy, to make the bigger states happy, before a bill or a tax or a law can be put into law, it's first got to go through a lower house, a House of Representatives. And this is going to be apportioned based on population. So every 10 years, the United States government will conduct a census. So recording this in 2020, there's a census going on right now. So we'll do a census every 20 years. When the census is, it'll count up how many people. And in the House of Representatives, you're going to get more votes for how many people you have. So when you count the House of Representatives, the way they originally do this is a little bit different than we would do it today, but for the most part it's the same. But Georgia, you have 1/10 of Virginia, so in this House of Representatives you only get one House of Representative member. Virginia, you're going to get 10. Not the exact numbers at the time, but pretty close. So you'll get 10 times as many people, Virginia, because votes, because you have 10 times as many people. So in this lower house, it'll be based on population. And to make those that are pushing for democracy happy, they're going to say in this House of Representatives, the people will select new House of Representative members every 2 years. So the way they worded, and we're going to come back to this in just a second, but the way they worded is every 2 years, these states will hold election to choose their House of Representative members. So you're holding a popular election to choose those House of Representative members. Now, it doesn't say anything about how states hold those elections. So states, and all states, as we're going to see, are going to put sex restrictions. Only men can vote. Some states are going to put race restrictions. Only people of European ancestry can vote. And good chunk of states are going to put property restrictions. Only people worth a certain amount of property can vote. But it's supposed to at least be somewhat democratic. So this lower house, based on population, and it's done by popular election. So a bill has to get a majority going through this lower house first. Then it goes to the Senate. The Senate is going to be apportioned differently. This is going to be to make Georgia and New Jersey and the smaller states happy. It's going to say every state, no matter the size, gets 2 senators. So you could be Virginia, huge state, 750,000 people. You're only getting 2 senators. Georgia, small, or New Jersey, small population, small state. You're getting 2 senators as well. So this is meant to make Georgia and New Jersey, you're not going to be outvoted. You might get outvoted by Virginia and New York in the House of Representatives, and the bill might get through there, but they can't outvote you in the upper house because the Senate, because the smaller states are going to have these 2 senators, which are going to prevent them from getting the bill out that way. So first got to go through the lower house, then it has to go through the upper house before, and ultimately it'll go to the executive branch for approval, but it's got to go through these 2 houses. And to make those who are nervous about democracy happy, they're going to have these 2 senators chosen by state legislators. So basically, every 6 years, and senators will serve for 6 years, they'll say, hey, North Carolina, send us some senators. And the state legislature, however they want to do it, will choose these state senators, or these senators to go up there. So this is basically putting a layer between the people and the senators. So the rabble, and I mean they really would use similar terms to that, can choose the House of Representatives, but then the Senate will be chosen by the state legislatures. So state legislatures might be chosen by the people, but then the state legislatures will then choose the senators. So at least there's some layer of responsibility there. So again, this is meant to make both sides happy, and it does. All the bigger states and the smaller states are going to accept this Connecticut Compromise or Great Compromise. So this is actually a depiction of this from the time of this Connecticut Compromise. You see right here, I don't know which side's which, but you have basically whoever be Georgia, New Jersey pulling on this side, Virginia and New York pulling on this side, and then Connecticut comes along with this compromise. I like this drawing not only because it shows the difficulty in this convention of making both sides happy, but also because it's got a fart joke. You see right here, there's a British soldier apparently shooting something out of his butt into somebody who also appears to be shooting something out of their butt, and then I think that might be a squirrel also shooting something out of their butt. This guy's saying a good shot. Ideas, I have no idea what that says. But anyway, the reason I mention that is because I know this is a boring lecture and I want some excitement. So we have a British soldier shooting stuff out of his butt. And this shows that, again, fart jokes are timeless and have been around forever. This is another fart joke from the time. I don't know what they're doing. It's some soldiers shooting cannonballs out of their butts or something. So fart jokes are timeless. Anyway, so here's a sort of an example of the bicameral legislature. Lower house based on population elected directly by the people. This is the House of Representatives. Upper house, 2 senators. Senators are elected by state legislatures. So the state legislatures pick them. We don't want the people picking those. Today we have it where where senators are picked through a popular election. That doesn't come along until 1913. So that's not the way it was originally intended by the founding fathers. So this is going to be the basics of how things are apportioned. What about enslaved people? So we've got this basic idea. There's going to be another argument before the Connecticut Compromise can be fully accepted. And this argument's going to come from these northern states. So during the American Revolution, slavery, first of all, slavery had not been very important to the economy of these northern states. Now, whether this owes to Puritan influence or the ability of cash crops to grow up here, whatever the case, slaves did not make up a large portion of the population up here during the American Revolution. And during the American Revolution, we saw a number of black soldiers, enslaved and free blacks, serving in the Revolutionary armies. And for this reason, these states basically said, slavery is not important. It's not a big population, so we don't mind them arming slaves to fight against the British. So we had blacks serving as patriots, slavery not that important, and we also had this Enlightenment sense going on, ideas like all men are created equal. This gets all these northern states starting in New England, and it's going to spread down here, this idea that slavery is wrong and we need to start getting rid of it. So by the time of the Constitutional Convention, a number of these northern states had already gotten rid of slavery. This is slavery, it's banned. If you have a slave, they've got to be freed. Other states, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, had started to put in place gradual manumission laws, basically saying, again, slavery is not that important to our economy. We need to start getting rid of it. And so children born to slaves will be freed, that type of thing. So slavery is on its way out up in these states. These states, that's not the case. Slavery is a huge part of the economy of these states, particularly like South Carolina. Slaves make up a majority of the population, probably pretty close in Georgia as well. Slaves probably only make up 25-30%, Virginia and Maryland, but still a sizable portion of the economy. So this is a huge percent of the population. But these guys down here, and even those at the Constitutional Convention like James Madison was a slaveholder. He's one of about a third of the delegates who are slaveholders. Even those guys, now there are a couple you maybe would argue this way, but the vast majority, even the slaveholders, they're hopped up on the Enlightenment idea that slavery is morally wrong as well. So it's a weird time to be making rules of slavery because these states are in the process of getting rid of it, and these states down here think slavery's wrong, it needs to go away as well. It's this general time period, the end of the 1700s, where people are viewing it as a moral wrong. But the people down here are going to argue we can't get rid of it immediately like you guys can because it's a huge part of our economy. There's also racism involved where, we don't want to get rid of slavery because it'll mean free blacks around, and we're not sure if we want to make free blacks equal citizens. But even understanding the racism, these guys are saying slavery is wrong, we need to get rid of it. And sort of the assumption that's happening at the Constitutional Convention is that eventually these states are going to get rid of slavery. So starting with Maryland, very soon Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, it's going to go away. And you actually see this as this provision in the Constitution saying we're not getting rid of it right away, but we should slowly get rid of it. They put in the Constitution the international slave trade can be eliminated in 1808. So that's this thought process. But when it concerns the legislature, these northern states are going to say, all right, if you guys aren't getting rid of slavery immediately, for the time being, you've got significant portions of your population that are going to count towards representation but not be allowed to participate in the government, not treated as citizens. And we don't think that's right. So you're going to see a lot of these northern states argue that slaves shouldn't be counted towards representation. So you shouldn't get more members of the House for your slaves. Well, these southern states, they want more representatives, they want more power to vote, so they're going to argue slaves should count towards representation. These guys come back, no, well, you consider them property, you don't consider them citizens, so they shouldn't count. Well, the argument will go back and forth until this something called the Three-Fifths Compromise is settled on. Now, the Three-Fifths Compromise, and this is in the Constitution, and this you can kind of see like the sort of shame about like having to put something in there. They don't use the term slave, they use the word unfree. But this Three-Fifths Compromise is going to agree that until slavery is going away, which again they're thinking is going to happen in a couple generations, as we'll talk about later, you'll see very soon the South will start arguing that slavery is morally right, but at the time, thinking it's morally wrong. It's going to go away in a couple generations, but until that happens, slaves will count as 3/5 of a person towards apportioning representation. So, just making up numbers here, but let's say Virginia has 100,000 slaves. Only 60,000 will count towards representation. So you'll only get one House of Representative member for the slaves instead of two. Same thing, South Carolina, let's say 100,000 slaves, only 60,000 will count towards representation. So this is meant to make both the northern states, they're not getting full representation for slaves, but also make southern states happy, you're getting some representation. As sort of a means to make the northern states happy, they're going to say that slaves will also count 3/5 towards taxation purposes. So they've given this national government the ability to tax. They don't know how they're going to tax just yet. As we'll see later, there's going to be taxes on alcohol, income tax much later. But they think that maybe they're going to do it based on population. And so the Constitution says slaves will count as 3/5 towards representation, but also 3/5 towards taxation purposes. Well, and again, Southerners don't like that part because they're getting charged taxes for slaves, 3/5. They'd prefer not to get charged taxes for slaves, but it's meant to be this compromise. Well, the thing is, the South's going to decidedly win this. We're going to see this go all the way up to the Civil War because, as we'll talk about, the South will get representation, at least some, for people that aren't citizens, but there's never going to be a tax based on population. So what's meant to sort of be a pushback to the representation, the tax, they just never tax that way. So the South gets additional representation without getting the taxes added onto it. So this is a legislative branch, can write laws, pass taxes, and can is apportioned bicameral legislature, House of Representatives, Senate. So that's the legislative branch. What about this executive branch? How are we going to do this? Well, at the time in 1787, again, this thing's going to go on from May until September. So they're debating this over the course of summer in Philadelphia. Well, there's a big fear that they don't want an executive that's going to be as powerful as King George. So they just got out of this this time period where the king started executing powers, and he's beholden to Parliament in a lot of ways, but he had a lot of absolute authority, and he could do a lot of things without limitation. So when they think about this executive branch, there's a lot of debate over how to do it. There's some talk, make it a council where you have 3-5 people serving on it. That would prevent one person from getting too powerful. Maybe do it like the Romans did with one politician, one politician, for peacetime, one for wartime. They're ultimately going to decide, I don't think that any of those is going to work. We need it to be in the hands of a single individual. We need one chief executive. Again, there's a lot of fear about making this, creating a king, so there's a lot of debate over this, but they settle on one chief executive who they're going to call the president, and he's going to have all the power to execute the laws of Congress. All right, so this president is going to wear many faces. So they're writing this Constitution. They start writing this portion for this executive branch, and they're basically going to determine this one individual, whoever the president's chosen to be, will be chief executive. So this president, he's going to be the one that if the legislature passes a new law, let's say they make it again, every British merchant has to get out of the country for the security of the United States or something, you've got to have somebody to go round up these British guys. So you need to basically make sure there's somebody to execute the law. So you need to hire the individuals meant to go investigate these guys, round them up. You need to have somebody to collect the taxes. So if the legislative branch decides to collect taxes on honey, you better have a tax collector or a bunch of tax collectors to go out there, make sure that stores are charging this tax. You got to have somebody to fulfill the laws. So he's going to be executive branch, executing the laws, carrying them out, collecting the taxes. They're also going to give this executive branch the ability to veto any bills passed by Congress. This is going to be, we'll talk about this a lot later, but in this way, the president will be this chief legislature. So he's actually kind of involved in the law writing process if he can veto things. So the president is also going to be considered the commander-in-chief. If there's a military engagement, you need to have this national army up and running. The president will move the army around, and he's going to execute the war. So as president will be commander-in-chief. He's also going to be placed in charge of state militias in the case of invasion, that type of thing. So very powerful, as according to the Constitution. They're also going to make this president head of state. So the president is going to be the one to appoint ambassadors to send to deal with France. You know, we have an issue with France. You know, we got an ambassador. Even during peacetime, you have ambassadors. That'll be the president who picks these guys. And the president can also create treaties with other nations. So let's say you and France are having a dispute. The president will, or one of the person he appoints writes a treaty and makes an agreement with France. The president will also be the one to appoint Supreme Court justices. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but put people in charge of the judicial branch. Final thing, president, obviously you can't do all this stuff yourself. You're going to need help. The president can appoint a cabinet to help himself. So this sounds incredibly powerful. And if, this little chart here has basically all the different jobs the president's going to have. He can execute the laws, deals with the foreign powers, put those things in the same thing, serves as a diplomat, that type of stuff, head of the army, and again, as veto powers, allow him to control the legislation, this type of thing. It sounds like an insanely powerful position, and it is powerful, but not as powerful as it sounds. I kind of want you to think about the executive branch as it's written in the Constitution, like you would think about, if anybody's seen Futurama, in Futurama, they have President Nixon's head in a jar. Basically, it's a joke where, Richard Nixon, somehow, they take the head off his dead body, they put it in a museum, and he's sitting there with his head in a jar, and I'm not a crook, all yelling in this museum, but he's powerless as a head in a jar. But later on in the show, he gets his robot body, and he just starts going crazy, and he becomes this huge, powerful body. Don't think about the executive branch as Richard Nixon with the robot body. Just think about it as him with the head in the jar, because without the legislative branch, and you can think of the legislative branch as the robot body, basically the president can't do anything, okay? So the legislative branch would be the robot body. The president, the executive, would be basically the head. I know that's probably a horrible analogy, but I'm just going to hopefully try to explain this. So commander-in-chief. The president is commander-in-chief, head of the army. That sounds insanely powerful. But the thing is, the legislative branch is the one that comes up with the ability to tax. They're the ones that are going to be able to provide the funds to pay soldiers. So sure, you could command an army. I don't care who you are. If you're not paying your soldiers, maybe they'll fight for you for a month or two based on loyalty or patriotism or whatever. If they're not getting paid, they're going home. So the president can control the military, but if the legislative branch isn't providing him with money, isn't providing with the money to buy guns, things like that, the army's going to be ineffective. They're going to run away. So sure, you can command the army, but there's not going to be an army without the legislative branch. President, head of state, can make agreements with foreign nations, can sign treaties. But the thing is, according to the Constitution, in order for treaties to be binding, they've got to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate. So president, you go over and make a deal with the King of France. We promise to do this. Well, the Senate gets back and looks at it. Nope, we're not doing this. They throw the treaty in the garbage. It doesn't go through. And also, so you appoint ambassadors to deal with foreign nations. They've got to be first approved by Congress before they can go anywhere. So you're head of state. You can make agreements, but they're not binding unless the legislative branch goes somewhere. Well, what about the chief legislature? Again, president can veto powers or veto laws and taxes they don't like. Well, that sounds powerful, and today it's powerful. You'll get presidents who don't like something, they'll veto it. Well, the way they wrote this in the Constitution was not intended to be that way. They wanted the veto only to be used if the president determined something was unconstitutional. They saw the president's veto as a determiner of constitutionality. So if the president gets a law up to his desk, he looks at it, looks at the Constitution, and says, this isn't something that we have the power to do, then he's supposed to veto it. That's the only time he's supposed to veto anything, per the thinking of these guys here. So today we think of a different group, and we'll talk about them in a second. Here's determiners of constitutionality. The way these guys thought of it is the president would determine constitutionality. Now, as we'll see later, presidents will sort of give up that idea and just veto whatever they don't like. But as it's originally intended, it was a veto only for constitutionality. All right. So your chief legislature, but you're only supposed to use it for constitutionality's purpose. So another thing, the president approves nominees to the Supreme Court. Well, first of all, as we're going to talk about, Supreme Court's not that powerful as originally written out in the Constitution, but even then it's got to be approved by Congress before your appointees can go up. And the final thing limiting what the president can do is the fact that the legislative branch can remove them if they want to. All this is going to take is a simple majority of the House votes to put the president, impeach the president, put him on trial, and then you need 2/3 of the Senate to do it, and then you can get the president out of office if you so choose. All right, so you have a powerful, it looks on paper very powerful, but there's a lot of limitations by Congress, at least as originally written in the Constitution. So we got this guy. How are we going to pick this executive? Well, there's going to be more debate about this because, again, the whole thing is going to come up. What do we, bigger states want more say in who becomes the president. Some people want democracy, the people to choose it. A lot of other people say, I don't think this is going to be something we should allow the people to choose. And as a matter of fact, when they're thinking this, not a lot of people are thinking this is a good office for the people to choose because, again, they think they're going to put in, people that are flashy, not necessarily people that are good. So how do we do this? Again, bigger states want more say. Smaller states want say. A handful of people want it chosen democratically. Majority of people, that's not something we can trust to the people. So what ultimately they're going to decide is to come up with something called this electoral college system. We're not going to get into this too much, but basically I want you to think about the electoral college system as one, a means to make the states happy. We want to make sure the states have a say in who becomes president. And two, this is kind of to keep this decision out of the hands of the people who a lot of people don't, especially at this time, don't trust to make a decision for this powerful office. So what the Electoral College is going to say is that we're going to do this to where every state will get the number of House Representative members they have plus the number of senators they have, which every state has 2 senators, will equal how many electors they get to send every 4 years. So the presidents are going to serve for 4-year terms, and they can serve, there's no limit on how many terms they can serve, but every 4 years, states will send X number of electors, so number of House Representative members you have, plus your 2 senators, and these electors will then go pick the most qualified person they have for president. So this is from Ohio. Ohio's not a state yet, but Ohio, Virginia, whatever. Ohio has 16 House Representative members because they have a large population and they have their 2 senators. So every 4 years they're going to send 3 people, and this is just basically 3 people, as was originally written in the Constitution, that the state feels are qualified to make this decision. So if you're doing it this way in modern times, Texas has 30 House Representative members, 2 senators. So every 4 years, Texas legislature would pick 32. And the way they're originally intending to do this, smart, qualified people. I should point out they're not thinking political parties here. They're going to get to that very soon. But there's not, the idea of political parties is not something they think is going to happen. So they think Texas is going to send 32 smart people, so they look around, maybe find a couple scientists, some businessmen, Mark Cuban, they find, maybe some former politicians, maybe some military leaders, and they say, we trust that you guys are going to go pick somebody good. Texas will send its 32. Wyoming has, I think, 1 House of Representative member and 2 senators, so they're only going to get 3. So smaller states, they're not going to have nearly as many electors, but Wyoming will send 3 qualified people. And so you're going to get these state legislatures picking electors, and the electors are not going to be members of the state legislature. They're going to be just qualified people. And you can also think about it as this is basically how this is set up. These are just qualified people picked by the state legislatures. So they think that people like us would be good to pick the president. So you're going to get these guys showing up at the Capitol every 4 years. They're going to have a debate. Then after this debate, each elector will get 2 votes. So you have a debate. I think this guy's a good candidate. I think this is a good candidate. And you vote. When the votes are counted, whoever gets the most number of votes will become president. Whoever gets the second number of votes will become vice president. Not the way we do things today. We'll talk about this later, but today we do it very differently. But what they're going to put here is that first number of votes becomes president, second number of votes becomes vice president. So if you're comparing that to recent elections, it would be, if it were still done that way, you would have President Clinton, Vice President Trump. Then you would have, you'd have President Trump, Vice President Clinton. Before that, you would have President Obama, Vice President Romney. But again, they don't do it that way because today there's a popular election, and I don't want to get into modern politics, but basically, and we are going to talk about this in a little bit, they've crammed the popular vote into this electoral system, but it's not meant to be that. It's just states choose people that they think are qualified, and they're supposed to be the ones to make the decision. And again, a lot of this is meant to keep this vote out of the people's hands. People weren't as educated back then, and also, they just don't trust the popular will to choose somebody that's qualified. So what they would have is, in order to get to this president, you have the people would vote for their state legislatures then choose the electors choose the president. So there's layers between the people because they want to keep this decision out of the hands of the people. Not necessarily any evilness or anything like that involved in there, it's just that they don't think they're capable of making that decision. So we have that is going to be how the president and vice president are chosen. Again, they're not thinking political parties. They're going to quickly think about that, but that's not something they're going to think about at the time. All right, so what about this judicial branch? So we have executive branch, a lot of space on that, way more space on the legislative branch. What about this judicial branch? Well, if you look at this Constitution they write up, there's very small space on judicial branch. All it basically sets up is there is a Supreme Court that will just try the laws of the United States. They're going to actually set up federal court system, but they don't explain how the federal court system is set up. And then they're going to have the Supreme Court set up that you can appeal federal crimes up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, will settle certain disputes between the states. So again, border disputes, that kind of stuff, issues between the states that can be decided by the Supreme Court. How is this Supreme Court set up? It doesn't exactly say. There's no details on there. Today there's 9 Supreme Court justices. That is not in the Constitution. And it doesn't say anything in the Constitution about the Supreme Court determining constitutionality. We'll talk about when that comes up, but at the time the Constitution is written, that isn't in there. That's not given over. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the Constitution, again, it's incredibly short here. Just says Supreme Court. The Supreme Court justice is picked by the president, approved by Congress. It doesn't say what they're supposed to do other than that they're going to try federal crimes that are appealed up to the Supreme Court. And then you can also, it will also say that, again, that it doesn't put the number of justices on there. That's going to be apportioned by law. It's going to be this crazy thing we'll talk about. I legitimately think they get to this section, and they think there's controversy if they do make the Supreme Court interpreter of constitutionality, and also I think they're tired. I think they get to this section by September. They've been around these guys for months. They probably are tired of dealing with one another, and I think they basically say, we'll figure this crap out later. I legit think that's what's happened. So they leave it really small here. So they're going to draw up this Constitution. Now all of these delegates are going to head back in September 1787, and they're going to have to go to their states and basically say, I know you sent us to amend the Constitution. Sorry, buddy, we went ahead and wrote an all-new Constitution. So we're going to have to see what the states say to that. Oh, darn you, what'd you do? Or are the states going to say, good job? We'll find out next time.